Welcome to the Why on Earth Community Podcast. I'm your host, Aaron William Perry, and today we're visiting with Vicki Hird, the author of Rebugging the Planet. Hi, Vicki.
Hi, good to be here.
Hey, it's great to visit with you, and what we're going to be talking about today is obviously one of the most important topics for our entire global community and planetary situation. So I'm really, really excited we have this opportunity to visit with you.
Great to be here. I have been so pleased with the reaction to the report and people's interest in it. So it's great to be speaking about it.
Wonderful. And I think for fun, we'll maybe refer to this episode as our Creepy Crawly episode.
Okay. As long as you don't put nasties in there, because they're not nasty.
Not at all. No, beloved maybe.
Beloved Creepy Crawlies, yes.
Vicki Hird is head of the Sustainable Farming Campaign for Sustain, the Alliance for Better Food and Farming, and she also runs an independent consultancy. An experienced and award-winning environmental campaigner, researcher, writer, and strategist working mainly in the food farming and environmental policy arenas. Vicki has worked on government policy for many years and is also the author of Perfectly Safe to Eat, The Facts on Food. Vicki's passion is insects. The first pets she gave her children were a family of stick insects, and she had a giraffe-necked weevil tattoo for her 50th birthday. Vicki also has a master's degree in pest management, and she is a fellow of the Royal Entomological Society. And Vicki, as you and I were just discussing before we began to record, today is your first day. Congratulations on a new job as a strategic leader on agriculture at the Wildlife Trust. So that's wonderful. Congratulations.
Thank you. Yeah, been a busy day, but it's good to be there.
Oh, I'm so sure. And yeah, thanks for taking the time on day one to visit with us. Okay. And really excited to dive into this. And to kick things off, I'm just gonna ask you a very open question. Like, why bugs? Why does it matter? What are we talking about?
Yeah, well, they're such a critical part of our ecosystem, part of our lives. And one of the reasons I wrote the book was because I don't think enough people recognize that or realize that, although I think that's changing. One of the reasons also that I wrote the book was I think people are beginning to be interested. There's been a lot more wildlife programs that cover invertebrates. There's been books, there's been like citizen science where people get involved. And I think we need to tap into that and understand what it means for people in terms of their lives, their politics, their consumption. So I wrote the book with that in mind, but also with the idea of making bugs their role and their brilliance and their beauty a bit clearer. So as a paperback, it's not a huge tome with loads of pictures, but there's a lot out there on invertebrates, but I just wanted to sort of distill it in one book with loads and loads of tips for what you can do as well, which was key for me as a campaigner. I always want to communicate what you can do, but they're also in trouble. That's the other reason.
Absolutely. Yeah. And we'll be talking about that and just to show those of our audience who are watching the video version of our discussion. This is a copy of the book. This is actually a Galley advanced copy. And yeah, the cover's so beautiful with all
It is nice, isn't it? Yeah. The diversity there. And it's not just insects. That's the important thing. Insects are critical, but all the other invertebrates, the species without a spine in our rivers, in our seas, on our land, in our soil, they're everywhere. Almost everywhere. So, and they're really critical, and combining them with the fungi, we certainly wouldn't be here without them.
Absolutely. Can you give us the bad news? Where are we in terms of what's happening with the invertebrates right now? Yeah,
there's some really scary long-term trend studies which shows over decades how the number of species and diversity of species has been declining where they've been actually looking, and that's not everywhere. So there's a big gap in the data, a big gap in the research, which I think scientists globally are beginning to fill. In the last 5 years, there's been a massive scientific recognition of the problem. So they're starting to look how we can fill that. funnily enough, just as an aside, one of the things we've been researching on invertebrates for the past 200 years is how to kill them, how to get rid of them, how to zap them. And now, there's a lot more money and research going into how to protect them, how to avoid destroying their habitats and their lives. So that's really exciting, but it does mean there's gaps. But what we're seeing is a combination of factors. There isn't one single thing, but we know that several different factors have been creating this big long-term decline in many species, and many critical species, but also species that we love, butterflies and mayflies, all sorts that we actually love because of how beautiful they are, but also they feed other things that we think are beautiful, like birds. And obviously they have critical functions in our food system, but climate change, habitat loss, losing their habitat, and their habitat being fragmented, which means they're really isolated. They're doing well in one patch, but they can't get to the next patch to mate, to recolonize, to feed, to have a refuge. They haven't got that corridor. Those fragmentations are really, really problematic, particularly in farmed land and land which has been heavily degraded through usually farming, but other reasons as well, like mining and development and encroachment from cities and towns. So those two are biggies, but also pollution. Pollution coming from pesticides, fertilizers, manure, particularly in river and marine environments, which have so many invertebrates in them, critical invertebrates. And so that pollution, but it's also things like plastic pollution and noise pollution. And so these biggies, climate change is a critical one because they're such small animals. Their surface to volume ratio is very high, so they can lose heat and lose water very quickly. So they can be particularly badly impacted when you've got extremes that they weren't predicting. At the same time, insects and invertebrates can adapt. They're known as very adaptable. They produce millions of offspring every year, many of them. So they can adapt. But, if we change it so fast as we are with the climate change and habitat loss and pollution incidents, then it's very difficult for them and they just crash. Or they don't thrive and they don't move around as they should. And so that's one of the things that we can all do something about, having gardens, having green spaces.
Yeah, absolutely. And as you and I previously discussed, we had Scott Xerxes on the podcast series, the executive director of Scott Black, the executive director of the Xerxes Society. And in that discussion, we were talking about what looks like potentially the sixth great extinction.
Mass extinction, yeah.
That we're observing in geological.
It's scary, very scary.
And I've heard some pretty staggering figures around biodiversity and biomass reductions. And he mentioned in Germany a study showing something like 75% decrease in flying insect biomass. That
was a big one, yeah. That was one that triggered a lot of media interest, yeah. It was scary.
So what's your read, what's your take on where we're at worldwide in terms of some of these percent changes?
Well, they are beginning to sort of do collective analyses of all the studies and, suggestions that 40% are at risk of going extinct. And some of these will be ones that we haven't even discovered yet. There's invertebrates even, around us that we haven't discovered yet in the soils, but in places in the global south, in South America, there's millions probably that we don't know about. So it's hard to say, but 40% is drawn from a lot of studies that we're potentially seeing mass extinctions. And then there's the sort of problem that you get when you get sort of extinction or crashes locally. And when I mean locally, it could be in a nation or in a region. And, we talk about foods and, we love foods. Chocolate and coffee, they rely on a very tiny fly to be pollinated. And if you lose that fly for other reasons, for deforestation, for pollution, mining elsewhere, you're not going to get the chocolate and you're not going to get the coffee. So it's things like that. And it is quite scary when you look at the figures about deforestation and removal of wetlands, critical wetlands in places. And we've done a lot of damage already. I live in the UK, in North America, you've got a lot of clearance already, but you do have your wilderness areas, which are amazing refuges. And our wilderness areas are much smaller. But we're trying. but there are some really serious alarm bells ringing that we've got to all act on.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, wait a minute. So it's one species of fly that pollinates chocolate worldwide?
It's a tiny, tiny fly. Yeah, I think there's probably different species worldwide that have learned how to do it. But from where chocolate originally came from, which I think might be Asia, but I might be wrong about that. But yeah, it's tiny. And so, you can't have another kind of species doing it because they'll be too big, or their wings will be too long, or they won't have the right mouth parts. These evolution of relationships between bugs and plants have been over millennia. And you can't recreate them that easily. However adaptable invertebrates are. But what we're trying to do in some parts of the world where they've lost their pollinators, like in China, they're actually doing hand pollination, and they're developing robotic bees. I talk about that in the book, actually. I think it's hilariously sad. The millions that will be spent and the resources like metals that will be used in creating robotic bees. When we've got something on tap that is free, replicates itself, does the best job, and gets right to the heart of the flower, we should be protecting the bees and the other pollinators absolutely without fail, rather than investing billions in robotic bees or spending millions in hand pollination. Hand pollination is suitable in some circumstances when you want to do things differently, but it's not a solution to world hunger without pollinators.
Oh my gosh, this reminds me of an episode we recently did with Tom Chi, who has a company called At One Ventures. And he's tracking all kinds of emerging regenerative technologies. And he was talking about in the energy industry, there was a multi-billion-dollar carbon sequestration plant that was funded by one of the big oil and gas companies that sequestered, or has the potential to sequester, the same amount of carbon as something like approximately 137 beavers, right? The animals that do their
thing for free. Yes.
And we don't have depreciation. We don't have machinery that's wearing out over time. And so
and lots of cement probably involved in that. Lots of cement, which is unbelievably bad for climate.
Yeah, exactly. So it's if and as we're getting more intelligent and harmonized with the natural brilliance, genius of all these different species and their roles, I think they're going to do so much more in the way of restoration and regeneration than probably many of our technology. Not to say we shouldn't do anything.
Absolutely, but there is like billions spent on that, which could be used to really reinforce the existing systems and natural systems that can do it so well, like forests and woods and beavers, as you say. They're amazing keystone species. But so wood ants, making sure the wood ants can survive. They provide a environment in woods, for instance, up in Scotland, which provide a really balanced environment of pests, predators, and pathogens and herbivores, making sure that the forest survives well. When you take them out, the forest declines and you get overabundance of pest species. So those keystone species exist in the invertebrate world as well as the mammalian. But the carbon capture and storage, which is possibly what was being referred to there, the carbon, it's still untried, it's still untested at scale, and they're pouring millions into it. Subsidies, our taxpayers' money is going into that. Yeah.
So it strikes me as interesting what you mentioned about the wild open spaces here in the United States versus the smaller versions in the UK. I'm curious from a land use perspective, what would your policy recommendations be in a place like the UK, given development patterns have already been deployed?
Well, we've got a very dense population in the UK. We haven't got as much land as you have to have wilderness areas that are genuinely left to rewild themselves and maintain themselves to a strong degree. But what we've done with our natural spaces and our natural parks, our parks that are supposed to be protected, is not protect them very well. I mean, seriously not. And you use them in ways which many think are deeply unsustainable, and certainly don't retain a nature and wildlife that we need to provide that refuge for those species. So there's a lot of campaigns to reinforce the rewilding approach to natural environment, natural areas. And then there's a whole spectrum. Like if you're going to farm in those nature parks, which we tend to have to because we've got a very large population that needs feeding and we don't want to draw food from elsewhere too much, to do it in ways which protect nature. And you can do that. You can do nature-based farming with a lot of really great habitat and rotations in the farm system, which can actually retain a really good population, diverse population of invertebrates, which will also help you when you farm. Like that pest predators, they're brilliant at doing what they do in a farm situation. But actually introducing that into systems which have been farming sheep for a long time or intensive cereals, etc. It takes a lot to change the culture and the habits and also the supply chains and the buyers. So it's a complex picture we weave if we're going to try and do more sort of wilderness areas in the UK. There's a lot of opposition. There's a lot of pressure. It's a bit of a hot topic here in the UK. But that's why I mention it. You've had your wilderness for many years, created by politicians and maintained, which we can be envious of, but we don't necessarily have the opportunity to completely recreate.
Yeah, perhaps a shout out to Teddy Roosevelt and others.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, he was a bit of a. But we have done things here. We have Greenbelt, we have national parks, but they are under a huge amount of pressure.
Mm-hmm. Amazing. Well, I want to be sure that we're talking about the invertebrates and soil and water, but before going there, the flying ones, the ones perhaps that many of us might think of more immediately. I drive through the Midwest with some regularity, and I've really noticed these past few years that we get far fewer bugs on the windshield than we did in the past driving there as a kid. And around here lately in Colorado, I've been actually thrilled to see more bugs on the windshield, as perhaps morbid as that might sound or counterintuitive as that might sound. What it essentially implies is that the populations are stronger, right? Stronger,
absolutely. It's funny, that was the subtitle of the book originally. When I originally put it to Chelsea Green, who was so great in accepting it, they said maybe the young people won't know what you're talking about when you say and how to get the bugs back on your windscreen, because we haven't had them for so long in the UK. Unless you're in an amazing organic farm or one of the good parks, it's very rare to get bugs on your windscreen. But funny enough, we have a Bug Life, which is the conservation organization for invertebrates. They do a splatter campaign every year, and they get people to print out a splatter test for their front of their car, and then you drive for a while, and then you send it in the results, and it's citizen science with the splatter test. But I think that's an indicator. If you're getting more in Colorado, that's really great. But I think the intensification of our farming systems, the neatness of it, the chemicals, the reduction in edges and woodlands, all massive factors in that. The invertebrates just haven't got a chance.
Mm-hmm. Wow, I love hearing about the citizen science work. We did something here. Of organizations and the city of Boulder with different organic soil amendments in people's yards, testing for carbon sequestration and biological.
Great.
Really a lot of fun to participate in that. That's cool to hear about.
We're actually starting to talk here about people getting money off their water bills if they have soil in their gardens, because people are starting to, too much concrete or tiling, or even worse, plastic grass. They are terrible in all sorts of ways, but they really don't absorb the water. So you get, potential flooding and things like that. So it's interesting fiscal measures that could help drive people towards that, and more carbon, knowing that they've got more carbon would excite people, I would have thought. So that's really clever of Boulder.
Well, that's amazing. How far along is that effort?
Not very far, as far as I know. I saw a headline. I thought I was very excited about it. We need to push it. We need to push those things. They're getting those nudge things that can help people make decisions differently. Although I think we should ban plastic lawns. Sorry, that's it. No plastic lawns, but I don't know if we'll get that. But there's all sorts of things people can do. Even if they've got concrete, they can put pots, do a lot. if they can't get rid of the concrete, they can do an awful lot for the bugs
Yeah,
and for
absolutely.
water. Mm.
What are some of the techniques if folks have a lot of concrete they're dealing with?
Yeah, well, we've got actually Chelsea Green have published a brilliant book by a guy, and I've forgotten his name right now, but I can share it with you. Who's done? He's the it's like balcony gardener or something like that, and he's got brilliant ways of producing amazing abundance in pots, in planters, even on a balcony you can produce a lot of food and a lot of flowers for the pollinators. And that book's got loads of ideas, and there's a lot on the internet as well about how you can raise a lot of plants in diversity, and diversity is key to protecting the bugs. So if you have a garden with mostly concrete, you can put a huge amount of planters, raised beds with soil, so you get the soil bugs as well, and healthy soil gives you healthy food. But even if you can't do raised beds, you can do little pots. If you've got a small yard, you could have 50 pots all producing different things and flowers at different times a year. And having that year-round flowering can be really important for the invertebrates in terms of a refuge, food source, nesting areas. So yeah, there's a lot everybody can do something.
Yeah, absolutely. We can all do something. I love this. And I'm starting to envision slogans: "Save the chocolate fly." And
yes. Plant something in your garden, save the chocolate fly. Well, that might be more to do with what you buy, so your lifestyle, because that's as critical as what you do in your area. So how you purchase chocolate, go for organic and fair trade, and shop around and find out what they're doing to actually reduce chemical use, because there are chemicals used in these systems. And chocolate and coffee can be grown in really great agroforestry systems because they're shade plants. So it's really great if they're mixed forestry systems producing coffee, cocoa, and fruits, and that can be really beneficial for the communities producing it as well. The mixed outcomes, feeding your local communities as well. So asking questions of your shopkeepers and your retailers.
Love it. Yeah, Vicki, my permaculture teacher, the late Scott Pittman, give him a big shout out. He did some consulting work for the Mars company decades ago. At the time, they were monocropping their cacao. Yeah. And experiencing all kinds of issues and problems that the chemicals
doesn't work. Monocrops eventually don't work, I think.
Yeah, he basically went in and recommended multi-story.
Exactly. 3D growing. Yeah, brilliant.
Exactly. It was really good. So chocolate coffee, and I'll just give a quick shout out. We've done episodes with Dr. Bronner's and with Equal Exchange, the
excellent
organic co-op with chocolate and coffee offerings that we can all select. And of course, recognizing the power of our consumer demand, in addition to our engagement with governance and policy and all of the things we can do in our own yards and neighborhoods and gardens, it really forms this, I think, trifecta. And I know, Vicki, you speak to this a lot in terms of calls to action, and maybe we'll repeat this at the end of the episode just to leave folks with it. But I was struck when we were chatting earlier about your way of framing what people can do about these issues.
Yeah, I tend, because it's a bit overwhelming, isn't it? The global crisis, and right now we've got unbelievable climate extremes going on, and that's going to accelerate. So people might get a bit overwhelmed, but I say to people, have a bit of a plan. If you understand the role of invertebrates in our environment, that they are absolutely critical for our pollination, for our soils, for our water systems. They do amazing filtration, but most importantly, they provide nutrients for all the food that we grow. Anyway, loads of ways in which they're critical, and also for our clothes and the wooden chairs we're sitting on. We wouldn't have any of that. So if you care about that, have a little plan, and the plan can be like what you're doing in your house or your garden or your local park, or even just the verge outside your block of flats, or if there's a space that you can actually start to talk to people about doing something on. So have a plan for doing something in your area or your garden or your house, even protecting the spiders, which are really great fly control as well. So have something for your place, something about your lifestyle. So we talked about, going fair trade, organic. Start to ask questions, start to explore where you can buy directly from the farmer because then they'll get more reward for what they're doing, so they'll be able to do it better. They can transition to what we call agroecological farming, which is like organic, and if they get such a tiny percentage that they usually get from a very complex supply chain, and then retailers who are incredibly cutthroat at the other end and all competing with each other to get people into the doors. So it's very complex and costly chain. So farmers often get very little. So if you can buy direct or go through something called a better food trader, then you are making a big difference. But it's not just food as well. It's also about what food you buy. Eating, things like everything from the land has an impact on invertebrates. So when things are very, very impactful on the land, for instance, livestock products, palm oil, oil seeds, they're all coming from either very intensive systems which require a lot of feed into the livestock, or produced using deforestation or destruction of really important wetlands. So thinking about what you buy as well. And there's loads of tips and ideas. This isn't a you must kind of thing. It's just think about what you buy, how it's infected the land. And so I give a lot of tips in the book, but think about eating less and better meat, fresh where you can. Junk food is really bad for the environment and the bugs. So that's the second thing. And then I would say, what you're wearing and your clothes, what you purchase, all that's important too, because a lot of that comes from the land. And then the final thing, so that's the second thing, your lifestyle. And then the third thing is your politics. You as a citizen, how you can influence your local politicians in how they manage the parks, or how they help people to choose differently. And then nationally, at a national, state or national level, how you can work with organizations writing letters to members of parliament or representatives, and being the voice for the bugs. And you can be a voice. If you join together, you can be a powerful movement. And in the book, there's loads of organizations you can join, and international ones as well as local ones. And joining together can be a very powerful thing to counter the might of some very powerful organizations, corporations that want the status quo, want to be able to continue to use chemicals that we know are harmful, or continue to drive production in a way which we know is the wrong direction for protecting our soils and protecting our invertebrates. I'll leave it there, but those three things, have a little plan how you can be a citizen, be a lifestyle change, and what your place is.
Thank you. It's so wonderful and inspiring. And we're actually, maybe I'll pick this up in our behind the scenes piece that we'll record after the main podcast interview, okay. But we're working on a resource for neighborhoods and homeowners associations to
brilliant
practices and rules to affect this kind of systemic change at the local level. And perhaps we can talk about that later in terms of something we might collaborate around, because the way you're articulating this and the work that you've been doing is so connected. We'd love to collaborate around that.
That would be great. I mean, what people can do in their gardens, particularly, I know the UK best, there's an incredible resource there to link up habitats. And so, with the local parks and local spaces. So there's a really amazing refuge that urban spaces can provide if we get it right.
Yeah. And I got to ask, we've done episodes here at the Regenerative Farm where I'm located with Nick DiDomenico and Marissa Pulaski, and also at a neighboring flower farm with Ollie Retzloff and his partner, Eric. And my goodness, the scenery in those episodes is so beautiful. And we talked about some of our favorite species. And I'm curious, for you, where you're located in the north of London, with your garden there, what are some of your favorite species for habitat and other invertebrates?
I do get asked this. I find it so difficult. But I will say, you mentioned my weevil that I've got on one shoulder, which is a giraffe-necked weevil from Madagascar. On my other shoulder, when I'm 60, I'm going to have a cockroach, because I always said cockroaches. I think there might be June bugs or mayflies in America, and different names. They've got many names, actually, the cockroach, around the world, but they're incredibly beautiful. They've got the most insane antennae, with sort of feathered antennae, particularly the males, they're bigger than the females, and they bumble around. They're big animals. They're just beautiful. So I will get that, but it's not my favorite. I don't have a favorite, but in my garden, I get very, very, very excited when I see hummingbird hawk moths. I got one the other day, and it's partly because I'd left some weeds to grow, which they like to lay their eggs on. And I watched it laying eggs on my cleavers, which is what the weeds were called. I let them grow. So I do let weeds grow, and I don't necessarily call them weeds. They're just, happy plants, and they produce a lot of flowers, some of them. So it was feeding and laying eggs, and I was just in heaven. And I put that on my Twitter feed and my Instagram, and it's just like you can hear my excitement. It really, because they're so big and beautiful, and they look like hummingbirds, and they're not that much smaller than hummingbirds, and they've got unbelievably fast wing beat, and they've got incredible proboscis, which can allow them to reach deep flower nectar flowers. So, and they've developed that, as we were saying, over millennia, to be able to do that purpose, have that purpose in their relation. And we get loads of hoverflies, which I love as well. They're so brilliant. And a lot of people misunderstand hoverflies. So I often use hoverflies as something about talking about rebugging attitudes, because some people will see a hoverfly like a hornet mimic hoverfly, which can be 2 centimeters long, looks big, and it's striped like a bee or a wasp, and people will be frightened. But if it's just a big fat pollinator, and it's amazingly beautiful the way it flies. So I use that as, getting children, don't get the fear in children, talk to them. That's a hoverfly. And even if you see a wasp, they're not going to hurt you if you don't hurt them. And, trying to rebug attitudes through seeing things and taking a photograph and sharing it and saying, these are credible, these ants, they're not going to do any harm. Let them be. Or if you can't let them be, shut them out, but don't use chemicals, and so on. I get a lot in my rather wild garden, as you can imagine.
I love it. Are there particularly favorite plants or herbs that you plant in your garden?
I've got an awful lot of alkanet, which I haven't planted at all, and any gardener will probably gasp with horror because it's an incredibly pervasive weed, but it produces very tiny blue flowers and a lot of plant matter, which you can actually compost. It's a brilliant compost plant to make compost tea in permaculture. I think use that a lot, but all the animals love it. The tiny flowers. I think, how on earth can that be a big honeypot? But they love it, and so I do like that, and I let it flower every year. But I have all sorts of salvias, and I do have some roses and lilacs that come and go depending on the year or whether I've pruned them properly. I'm not a great gardener, to be honest. But the key to gardening for invertebrates is diversity. Whatever the question, the answer is diversity and no chemicals. And when you buy plants, try and avoid ones that have been grown with chemicals, if you can ask questions of your garden centre, and avoid peat as well. Peatland are really, in the UK and maybe definitely across the globe, peats are being taken up to provide fuel and to provide medium for growing plants for horticulture. And that is destroying one of the most biodiverse and carbon-rich habitats on the planet. The amount of carbon in a peat bog is extraordinary, and the amount of wonderful invertebrates and plants as well. But we've got to avoid peat. So if you're going to a garden centre, say, I want it peat free, please, and chemical free.
Yeah, absolutely. So I guess heading in the direction of soil and some of the wonderful invertebrates that make up the soil ecology of the world. Tell us a bit about that and what's going on there.
Yeah, well, I mean, I did talk about earthworms quite a lot in the book. One of the things that alarmed me particularly, I think it was one of your big magazines, had a huge what's it called? A episode of the magazine, which was all about the impact of climate change on the earthworms. Because earthworms, it found in almost all habitats around the globe, because they and worms, they provide such an important role in the soil, not only by making their habitats through it and creating spaces for water and air to penetrate, which is absolutely vital to make a good soil for plants to grow in and for other animals. But they also provide an incredibly important environment for the microbes and the fungi and the spore spores of the fungi they're like truckers. They're like the big truckers in the soil environment, taking nutrients and taking spores and taking microbes from one place to another and inoculating another place which maybe is low on them, because they're sticky. They've got sticky epidermis, and also in their stomachs, as they ingest plant matter, they defecate an incredibly rich soil improver, which is full of invertebrates, full of microbes and important things. So those invertebrates, like worms and nematodes, are critical. But there's also a wonderful thing. If you ever get a chance to look online, to look for images of springtails, you'll fall in love. You'll never see them unless you have a really good camera, but you can see them online because they are beautiful. They are so cute, and they are a form of invertebrate that does a really important plant matter digesting process, and in the soil everywhere. Springtails are everywhere, and they're very, very important. And I also fell in love with tardigrades, which I think might be called water bears, or moss piglets, which are great. And they are important everywhere as well. They're found everywhere, and they're almost indestructible. They've found that they can be completely desiccated for decades and come alive again, and radiated and all sorts. So tardigrades or water bears are another favorite of mine. But there's so much in the soil. And so when we disturb the soil, if the soil is already well looked after, disturbing it with ploughing or tilling isn't a disaster, but it does have an impact. But where you've got soil that's been completely overworked, and chemicals poured on year in, year out, month in, month out, that has such a bad impact, those chemicals and the disturbance, that the rhizosphere, which is really important, the mycelium of the fungi, on which is a critical part, as are the invertebrates, can all be disrupted, and the invertebrates can be harmed. So you're looking for systems of farming which are really creating good soils. Soils above them. But people often don't think, as they're walking on soil, what's going on underneath, but there is a whole citizenry down there of invertebrates working with the fungi and everything else to keep us safe and keep us fed and healthy.
I love it. And Vicki, talking about the water bears.
Yeah, I think I've got a cuddly one somewhere. It's gone missing, but somebody knitted me one, and it was so lovely.
Oh, how fun! I've heard they can survive in space.
They have taken them up there and brought them down again, and they're pretty instructional. And as such, they're providing incredible research material, in their genes and how they do it, and the chemicals, within the system, as are many, like the fungi as well, and invertebrates that can withstand freezing. There's quite a few actually soft-bodied invertebrates they find in the Antarctic environments, which can freeze during the frozen month and then unfreeze. The chemicals that they use in their little bodies to do that, extraordinary. Yeah, real brilliance in the way they've been evolved over millennia.
You mentioned in the book biomimicry, which is a concept a lot of folks are familiar with, more people are learning about, and it reminds me of that, because some of the sort of antifreeze analogs in some of these species we might be able to learn from.
Actually, and also biomimicry in terms of like some of the cuticles and the makeup of the exoskeleton, which covers all insects, adult insects, and they're looking so much at how to recreate those incredibly robust materials, which we could create, I don't know, other things that we need as we go forward, which are also carbon based, not fossil fuel based, in a good way, and clever. There's a beetle called the diabolical ironclad, which is a big beetle, and you can roll over it with a car and it won't get destroyed because of the way the layers have been made, and the whole chemical makeup and structure is extraordinarily smart. And they're learning how to do drones by looking at how flies fly, and how termites create their termite mounds that are incredibly sophisticated, temperature and water control, and using the external climate to maintain the the temperature and moisture in ways that mean that they can create huge colonies and huge amount of babies in the way that they do, which, they can be destructive. And in the UK, we don't have termites. I know they can be a destructive force, but we're the biggest destructive force in reality. So we should be able to share space with them if we can.
Absolutely. Speaking of these large colonies, you also you talk about super colonies, and there's
Yes.
You mentioned in Southern Europe, there's a super colony of ants stretching some 3,700 miles.
Yeah, it's amazing. And I often liken it to, and if they meet each other, even if they're thousands of miles away, if they meet one from, that may have been carried, we do a lot of species transfer through our trading systems and our journeys, and traveling and holidays and stuff. So if you get an ant traveling to the other part of the world, if they happen to be from the same original species, they'll say, hi, how are you? Like, Arsenal supporter will say hi to another Arsenal supporter on the other side of the world. But if it's a Manchester United supporter, and if it's, so if it's an ant from a different species, even though they look pretty much the same to us, they'll fight. But they can recognize each other so well because they have such brilliant communication tools. Honestly, we think we're brilliant with the internet and our, we telephones and all that. They did it well before us. They have so many tools to communicate, especially in the social classes like the wasp, the ant. There are spiders that are social as well, and bees and termites, and they're so clever. So many different ways of talking to each other and creating a work set up that they all know their role. They all know what they're for, be it nursing the babies or fighting off intruders or collecting food or being the queen. But it's all through communication and genes, and it's so clever. I just, in the respect I have for them, before I had it anyway, but since doing the book and delving into the new research that's out there, since I last did deep research, it was just astounding. And you're right, the ants are amazing, and termites too. They've created huge colonies over very vast areas, all the same family.
Amazing. Yeah, I love the analogy of the sports fans in
Yes.
the world.
Yeah.
For folks who don't know Arsenal or Manchester United and don't listen to the BBC sport updates, talking about football, not American football, but soccer.
Yeah.
And that's brilliant. That's such a fun way to think about that.
Yes. And they have to fight because they've got to protect their space. In nature, Aaron, you know this, there is a huge amount of collaboration, but there is obviously conflict as well. That's how it is. We've all seen the amazing safaris in Africa on wonderful nature programs, and the lion getting its prey. That happens. But I think an awful lot going on in nature is actually collaboration, or leaving each other, giving each other space. But it's incredible, the collaboration between invertebrates and plants, for instance. We already know about pollination, but there's many more ways they collaborate. And humans as well. I talk about in my book where humans are using invertebrates, like I think it's the weaver ants, which in Asia, they've learned over many hundreds of years to use the weaver ants to stop, they can create huge colonies of weaver ants in their fruit plantations, and the weaver ants stop the other invertebrates and other species that would take the fruit and cause economic harm to the farmer. And so they look after the weaver ants in these huge colonies of beautiful nests that the weaver ants create. Just one example, many out there.
Oh my gosh. Well, I want to ask you about water species, but before we go there, let me just remind our audience, this is the Why on Earth Community Podcast. I'm your host, Aaron William Perry, and today we're visiting with the author of Rebugging the Planet, Vicki Hird. And Vicki, I'm so thrilled to share that this book is published by our friends and partners at Chelsea Green Publishing. And I want to give them a shout out along with a few of our other partners and sponsors of our podcast series. By the way, you can get a 35% discount on this and any of the other Chelsea Green books, audiobooks, etc., going through our whyonearth.org website, linking on our partners and supporters page if you'd like to. And that we have, in addition to Chelsea Green, we have Purium Organic Superfoods to thank. They also are offering a special discount to our friends and network. We've got Earth Hero, the sustainability home goods and yard care company. Waylay Waters, biodynamically grown hemp infused aromatherapy soaking salts. Earth Coast Productions, our technology and video production partner. Soilworks, our biodynamic soil additive blends. And of course, our many ambassadors, especially those of our ambassadors who have joined our monthly giving program. And if you haven't yet joined our monthly giving program and you'd like to, you can just go to whyonearth.org, click on the donate or support button and set it up for whatever amount you'd like. If you want to give at $33 or more per month as a thank you, we'll send you a jar of the Waylay Waters soaking salts to not only help support some of the biodynamic and regenerative farms we're collaborating with, but also your own health and well-being. And of course, I also want to be sure to share that Vicki's work can be found at rebuggingtheplanet.org. And on social, she's at Vicki Hird, that's VICKIHIRD, on Instagram, Twitter, and now, this is the first time I've said this ever, Threads. So check her out there. And before we got recording, we also discussed, Vicki and I, buglife.org.uk as a great resource. Now, I want to be sure to emphasize in the back of Rebugging the Planet, not only are there a number of rewilding actions that you can take listed out and describe, but there's also a whole bunch in the way of resources and additional places and organizations and people you can explore to learn even more about all of this that we're talking about. And yeah, Vicki, such a joy to have this chat. And so we've been talking about the invertebrates in the air, the invertebrates in the soil. Let's talk about the water for a while.
Yeah. Well, I mean, it's hard to exaggerate the role that the invertebrates have. I mean, the interesting thing is there aren't any insects, bar one, in the oceans, in the properly living in the oceans. And that was one of the things I actually found out writing this book, which was fantastic. There's something called the sea strider, which has very long legs, as you can imagine. And I think the name is used in a lot of games, gaming things, online gaming. So if you look up sea strider, you might get to a game before you get to the actual bug. But they live in the ocean. They feed on detritus and little fish and other dead animals. But in the oceans, it's mostly other invertebrates, not insects. And that's an interesting question, why? But people think they have the answers, but there's a huge amount of vertebrates. And the tiniest ones are so critical, such as the zooplankton, because the zooplankton is everywhere in the marine environment. And they have a relationship with the phytoplankton, which is the tiny plants in the marine. And these are so critical for the way in which the seas work and the marine environment works in terms of absorbing CO2 and turning it to plant matter. And the zooplankton will eat some of that plant matter and create nutrients for other plants. And that very delicate and complex system can be threatened by climate change. As we know, it's heating the seas, and there's a real risk and also fishing habits and whaling, removing large amounts of the species in that complex environment can have a really destructive impact on those invertebrates that play a critical role. And also, obviously, a lot of invertebrates most of them form the beginning of the food chain in the marine environment. So if you like fish, you got to like the invertebrates, or the invertebrates that make sure that the phytoplankton, if they're herbivorous fish, and so on and so on. So it's unbelievably complex, but all the way up to the large whales. Some of them actually directly eat the krill, which is the tiny prawns that some of them live on. It seems incredible. Some of the largest animals on the planet eat the smallest, but they rely on the krill, which is tiny invertebrate. So in the marine environment, unbelievably important, but not many insects. But in the freshwater habitat, you've got so many insects which do a very critical process of turning the plant matter, which often arrives in the marine environment, into more digestible, smaller pieces for the microbes and digesting fungi and microbes to do their work. Without it being broken down, it won't be easily accessible to those microbes, and then that releases the nutrients again for future plants to be grown within that water habitat, or in banks, or in, if that water is withdrawn for putting on fields to grow our food. But they also do a lot of cleaning. They're filtering a system. So we used to rely very much on reed beds and invertebrates to do the filtration of water coming out of, our water closets and our sinks, etc. So they were critical. And little animals called rotifers, which I talk about in the book, they're called rotifers because they've got a little head of cilia, which looks like a crown, and the cilia are used to filter in, like a bit like you might think a jellyfish, which is also a very important marine invertebrate. But those cilia draw in the little bits that we want to draw, want to take out of the system. So I mean, the water environment, you've got your mollusks, your bivalves, you've got your invertebrate and insect larval forms. If you like dragonflies or mayflies, they live most of their life in the river, and they are beautiful, but they're incredibly voracious carnivores. They will eat an awful lot of animals in that system, which is an important part of the system, because you need to have, for instance, you could say the mosquito larvae eaten by the dragonfly larvae. So there's a wonderful web in the freshwater habitat, and if you've got a pond, you'll have seen that. And all the mollusks like the snails, water snails, and slugs. And if you don't like slugs in your garden, create a habitat for the leopard slug, because the leopard slug will eat the other slugs. Anyway, it's a complex thing. And a lot of Chelsea Green books, some of the Chelsea Green organic gardening books, for instance, give loads of ideas about how to best create a garden which uses nature to control, the whole nutrient, the pests, the disease brilliantly, and they do. So, but the water habitat, it's absolutely critical to be stopping polluting it in all the ways that we do, or over abstracting it, and that's very difficult. And we're seeing droughts and floods in extreme situations, which we need to really start to do something. We need to stop climate change, or keep it within 1.5 degrees in order to stop it getting worse. And then manage the transition to agroecological farming and rewilding and nature-based solutions to hold the water where it lands. That's critical. Upland of a town, if you haven't got the trees there, the water will just rush down and flood the town. That's very simplistic, but it's actually true. So put the trees back, and you can do trees with food as well, with agroforestry, and you can do farming well that will retain the water as well, by making sure you've got cover crops during the winter months. Again, that's, there's a lot, it's touched on in my book what you can do, but it's not necessarily for farmers, because there's a lot of farmers out there. They need detailed information, but it's interesting to know what farmers can do and why you should buy from them if you can.
Yeah, absolutely, Vicki. Thank you for that. And look, I think for all of us, we're all one way or another putting consumer demand signals into the global economy. And, we think of the webworks of the ecological relationships, and we very much have webworks in our economic relationships as well.
Absolutely.
And, you mentioned in the book that at least $57 billion per year of food that we trade in the formal economy is completely dependent on invertebrate pollinators. And ironically, so many of the very large companies and global corporations that are doing so much of our food production and food processing continue to be the major users of certain toxic chemicals, and or are requiring farmers that supply them to utilize certain toxic chemicals. And I wanted to point out, not to shame and blame or call out necessarily any particular company. And I know that in virtually every major company right now, work is being done on the inside by people who understand that many of these practices and behaviors can be done better and need to change. And of course, we see more and more farmers transitioning to regenerative practices, which is beautiful. And I just want to share, right, because you make this express, and I think it's important we really understand this. You say Agricultural commodity traders are now the most powerful companies in the industrial food chain. 6 companies control most of the global food trade and earned somewhere around $380 billion. And these are 2018 numbers.
Yes. It's changed since the Ukraine invasion, definitely.
Yeah, revenues of the world's largest, the privately owned company Cargill, were at 115 billion at that time. So, just tell us from your perspective, what is this? Why do we need to know about this?
There's so many problems with it. I mean, it could be I could just boil it down to money and power. They've taken so much power out of the farmers' hands and out of the citizens' hands, and although you think you've got a huge cornucopia when you go into the shop, it's actually a lot of the same stuff just packaged up to make you buy it. But they've taken power from the farmers, consumers, and the governance, our government's hands, because they're supernatural, they're international, they don't necessarily do what any government tells them. And they take an awful lot of the wealth of the food system. And I think if we don't start to control them, that's a really big part. This won't work, because they're driving a demand globally, and particularly in areas which haven't had this, for highly processed foods, for very, junk foods, as you call them, fatty, sugary, salty foods that come inevitably from big monocultures, heavily chemically sprayed monocultures, because farmers have to produce very cheap raw materials for this junk food to go to fill the supermarket shelves, instead of the food ingredients which we used to just have access to mostly. I'm not against treats, I'm not against ready meals. It's just the volume of it, the dominance of it is a big part of the problem, and that's what feeds Cargill and the others pockets, because that's what they trade in, and they're so powerful. It's deeply worrying, and we need to take back that power through what we buy, and trying to purchase, as I said earlier, fresh if you can, or at least minimally processed, and ideally go through a great trader, like a shop that buys from local farmers, or just do a bit if you can. But also it's healthier for you if you don't buy very highly processed foods, which are being increasingly dominating across the globe. That's what we want the UN and other global institutions to address, and start to really celebrate and protect and nurture local food systems, wherever they are. And those farmers that should be at the heart of that, and be able to produce diverse produce, not huge, cheap raw material monocultures for these enormous companies. This is happening in South America, it's happening in Asia, but it's already been well established in Europe and North America. And so we've modeled this approach. We need to really unmodel it, model a new approach, and we can do that.
Absolutely, Vicki. Yeah, I'm so struck that throughout the food supply chains, when we're looking at regenerative practices and really healthy and nutritious, and what we might call like slower food practices, the margins are not that great.
They're not great.
It's interesting that for the giant corporations, these highly processed foods have actually very fat margins. And interestingly, as you mentioned, they also are among the primary contributors to many of the health and emotional and even mental health epidemics we're seeing worldwide. And as I wrote in my book, Why on Earth, when we're getting that candy bar or that can of soda for a dollar or two, or a pound or two, or a euro or two, or whatever, a yen or two, it's doing two things. It's maximizing the flow of that dollar right back to the giant corporation, and because of special formulations in the sugar, the fat, and the blending, it's causing us almost like an addiction to want to buy the next one as soon as.
Absolutely. Incredibly addictive. And that's exactly how they know this. The companies know this. And that's why it's grown and grown and grown. It's playing on a physiological trick in our bodies, which comes from when we needed a bit of sugar. We'd find a hive, wild honeybee hive, and would be ecstatic, but you don't get, now we've got honeybee hives in our fridge effectively, in the form of soda and heavily fatty, sugary, salty products. It's a disaster for the planet and our health. And I also think they're investing heavily in non-soil based systems. In the UK, there's an awful lot of interest in vertical farms and hydroponics. And I think they probably have their place. We'll have to do some of that. But to have a non-soil food system entirely feeding us worries me deeply, because of the microbiota that's in our stomachs, and actually our whole bodies are full of other bugs. We have a whole community in us, and that's partly from our food system. And removing that, it's an unknown impact, I think.
Yeah, and we're seeing a lot of research around neurobiochemical performance, cognitive performance, mood.
Yes, exactly. Yeah. It's all connected. And it's connected to the soil and the bugs in the soil and the bug stomachs in the soil, I think. Yeah. People don't like to think about that, but it is true, and it's healthy. It's not unhealthy. Yeah.
It's amazing. I spoke with a colleague a number of years ago who had fled the big corporate ag world and was doing work in the regenerative ag world more recently. But he was connected to one of the giant fast food companies' laboratory, where they concoct the blend of about 25 chemicals for the French fries. And I won't name any names.
Yeah.
Golden Arches or whatever. But basically what they did was determine the blend of chemicals that would act on the body's neurobiochemistry in the very same way that heroin, opioids,
scary
addictive behavior, right?
Yeah. And advertising is like that as well. The advertising is and marketing and promotions so sophisticated. We don't realize that we're being manipulated. Even I'm susceptible. We're all susceptible. We see adverts every time we step out the door, or turn the telly on, or put a game on for our kids. The advert and promotion is driving us to buy these things in a way we don't really realize. It making us feel good. If I buy that product, it makes me feel good. I'm smart, or I'm healthy, or I'm muscular, or I'm it's brilliant. Absolutely brilliant. If we could turn that brilliance into something else, to driving us to actually rediscover cooking and eating ourselves, it'd be so great. But then they won't make their money from that. I mean, it's fair to say that, as you said, that the supermarkets don't make a huge amount of money. In the UK, we did a piece of work at the end of last year that showed just how tiny amount of money goes to the farmers. They're less than 1p, far less than 1p for a loaf of bread, 0.09 pennies, which I can't imagine in cents, but it's almost nothing. And cheddar and carrots and apples, they got almost nothing. The supermarket didn't get that much either, but they're so large that they can get a lot, but there's an awful lot in the middle which takes the wealth. So it's not as simple as saying supermarkets bad, farmers need more. It's something that we've got to get our governance to do something about, have fairer supply chains where farmers get a decent reward for producing agroecologically and looking after their animals and all this kind of thing. So it's a complex thing which we can't all do as consumers. We can do something, but we really need to demand more of our governments.
Absolutely. Let me share this other passage from your book. Just 10 companies: Nestle, PepsiCo, Coca-Cola, Unilever, Danone, General Mills, Kellogg's, Mars, Associated British Foods, and Mondelez control almost every large food and beverage brand in the world. And they make, as you mentioned, as we've been discussing, they make some of the largest profit margins in the food chain. And you also mentioned that just 30 global supermarket chains control a third of the global retail food market. So yeah, this is extraordinary. And look, some of these companies, Danone or Unilever, are actually already doing some work in the regenerative agriculture space. Right? So we're seeing some movement, and we need a lot more. And so, yeah, to your point, the consumer demand and the pressure on policy are I think the two levers. And I love your commentary about the advertising, the storytelling, messaging, the power here, because what we're anticipating is over the next few years, we're going to see a whole lot more of really effective storytelling and messaging coming from the regenerative and stewardship oriented businesses.
That's great. That's great. And ideally, they will be able to tell a story which will be about the health of the soil and the health of the the wildlife, including the invertebrates, but also the health of your body, and in a way that really drives it in the right direction, so drive consumers in the right direction without making them pay a fortune. I mean, one of the problems is, the really good stuff costs more, which is crazy. And they have to declare themselves, whereas the bad stuff, they don't have to declare that they've got this, that, and this chemicals, in the production. They might have to do the ingredients list, but they don't talk about which neonicotinoid insecticides were used in the production. Whereas organic producer has to certify organic. Something really unbalanced about that. But in the future, hopefully, that will shift, and more people will be able to afford really, good regenerative agroecological production.
Absolutely. Well, it's Vicki, such a joy to have this opportunity to visit with you. And of course, we're going to, after wrapping up our main podcast episode, going to take a few minutes with our behind the scenes chat for our ambassador network. Again, if audience, you would like to join the ambassador network, please go to whyonearth.org and you'll get that journey started with us there. And so, Vicki, before wrapping up here and transitioning to that, I just want to thank you, of course, for joining us.
My pleasure.
And give you the floor. If there's anything else you'd like to share or say with our audience, please, the floor is yours.
I would say if you're listening or watching, if you can be an ambassador for the invertebrates in whatever way you can, that will be really great. One of the things that often happens with children, they adore invertebrates, they're fascinated by them, but as they get a bit older, they get the fear, and that fear usually comes from older people. So try and not be the person that gives them that fear, but gives them the fascination and maintains that fascination. But also with your colleagues, with your family, in your community, in your parish, your churches, talk about the importance of the invertebrates. If you can read about it in the book or on my website, their role in our lives is so critical. So be bug ambassadors if you can, and have a bug plan. Just 3 things you can do over the next year, and that'll be really great. But spreading the word is critical.
Absolutely. Brilliant. Well, thank you so much, Vicki.
My pleasure.
The Y on Earth Community Stewardship and Sustainability podcast series is hosted by Aaron William Perry, author, thought leader, and executive consultant. The podcast and video recordings are made possible by the generous support of people like you. To sign up as a daily, weekly, or monthly supporter, please visit whyonearth.org/support. Support packages start at just $1 per month. The podcast series is also sponsored by several corporate and organization sponsors. You can get discounts on their products and services using the code YONEARTH, all one word with a Y. These sponsors are listed on the whyonearth.org/support page. If you found this particular podcast episode especially insightful, informative, or inspiring, please pass it on and share it with a friend whom you think will also enjoy it. Thank you for tuning in. Thank you for your support. And thank you for being a part of the Y on Earth community.